welcome back. Today we're going to have a little chat about the Saturn 4 Ultra resin 3D printer sent to me by Elegoo for review. Get that out of the way nice and early. I've been messing about with it for the past week or so, and I think it's very close to being the best printer that they've sent me so far, but there are a few things about it that don't quite hit the spot for me personally. But that being said, for what it does it very, very well. I think really the pros outweigh the cons. So let's take a look at the printer, take a look at the prints that came out of said printer, and then we will talk about the things that potentially might need some work and a few of the dangers that come along with what they've decided to do with the Saturn 4 Ultra. Before we get into the printer itself, I know you'll be interested in the specs. So we've got a 10-inch 12K mono LCD screen, which is the same as the Saturn 3. Despite being more complicated mechanically, it weighs less than the Saturn 3 did. I'm not sure how they managed that. The build volume is effectively 218 by 122 by 220, which is smaller than the Saturn 3, but it does have a printing speed of 150mm an hour, which is the same as the Saturn 3 Ultra, but a lot quicker than the standard Saturn 3, which is what I've been using the most up until this point. So, the Saturn 4 Ultra. First change, this lid. This is not one that you take off completely. Instead, it's hinged at the side, which, to be fair, I prefer. I like that a lot more than lifting the whole thing off, because lifting the whole thing off, I don't know, I just find it to be a pain. Then it gets in the way and you've got to find somewhere to put it. Significant differences continue from the previous lot. This is a much different build plate. I mean, for a start, the fact that instead of having a screw on top, you've got a lever, makes it a lot quicker to take on and off, obviously. I will say something that it doesn't make quicker is cleaning the build plate, because there's a big old gap. Now, this does make sense when you look at how the printer works, but trying to clean inside of that, and I've done a bad job there, it's very difficult without just unscrewing the whole thing. You've got multiple screws keeping that bed attached. I mean, you can see there that I've just not managed to fully get to it. That is shifted since I tried to clean this plate. You can take the plate off the platform, so that is something you can do to get to it, but just when it comes to quickly cleaning, that's not really an option. The biggest thing is this tank, because it shifts, it moves. The build plate goes down into the tank then basically tilts and peels the prints away from the FEP, as opposed to just dragging them up like you would see on like the Saturn 3, Saturn 2, normal Saturn, the Mars printers, all of those. It's interesting, and it does work really well, to be fair. They've done a really good job with it, but it does also have slight complications, which we'll talk about in a minute. We also have over here a little AI camera. That is just a little dust cap, little lens cap, right there. That, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about the camera, because it's a good idea, badly implemented in my opinion. Now, this does come with a big old drip tray, which I have used. This is mostly alcohol splash, which I've only just noticed as I started filming. But you know what? You know it's been used. A significant change like the Saturn 3 that I've got, for instance, is this UI. This is quite different. It's fine. It works pretty well. It's, you know, touch sensitive. You can scroll from side to side. It's a little bit hampered by the fact that I've still got this tab on, which I've saved. I've saved this for you. Oh, the satisfaction. It just doesn't get old doing that, does it, on electronics? So, yeah, I mean, this screen works perfectly well. There's nothing wrong with it. It's not laggy or anything. It's responsive. It's all good. You can use this to do self-tests. So this is going to be a good way to show what happens here. So if we click that, then we can see how the tank moves around, which does take some getting used to. Like, it does feel a bit weird for some reason. I've never had a printer like this. I'm sure there will be those of you who have, and this won't be that much of a big surprise. So it basically runs through a big long checklist of stuff, and that's it. Oh, the typo's still there. That's brilliant. Reflesh. I called this printer the Flesh Smith, specifically because of that little typo. It made me laugh. On the printer itself, there's also a print mode here where you've got high speed and low speed. Now, obviously, high speed is quicker, low speed is slower, but the fact that that is just accessible here and you can switch it via this instead of it being like baked into the file that you send to the printer, it's a change that I think takes a bit of getting used to, but I mean, it works well enough. That's pretty much all you need to do. In terms of calibrating this, in terms of getting it set up and ready to go, that's it. You now just pour some resin in and off you trot, which is really, really nice. It's auto leveling. You don't have to worry about any of that. That's all sorted. So yeah, I mean, in terms of getting it set up and ready to go, very, very easy. So the Saturn IV Ultra is really easy to set up. You take it out of the box, you attach the build plate, you make sure the tank is screwed down, it runs all of its self checks, it auto levels. All you need to do is pour resin in it and set it to work, which is all really, really good. But does it produce good print? That's the really important bit. So I set the Saturn IV Ultra printing these. I've got 3 incredible chunky Cauldron Knights from Saint Decent. There'll be a link to the creators for these in the description, and also this from Bestiarum Games, because I mean, I love Bestiarum Games and I love the things they produce, and this is a fairly complex model with a ton of different textures on it, things that I hadn't even noticed on the file itself. So you can see on this big axe glaive, the massive blade on a stick, lots of very delicate patterns going on there, and they have come out really, really nicely. I'm hoping you can see all the detail doing it this way. There are a few scratches and stuff because I had a real issue getting the supports off this model. It was very, very well supported, don't get me wrong, but I really struggled to find a way to get them off without damaging anything. You can see as well on things like the wings, the feathers have come out super, super nicely. Loads of really crisp, clear detail. And then we've got all of the weird, gribbly, maggoty... Oh, I missed a little bit of support there. Can you see that? I mean, there's a lot. There's a lot going on texture-wise on this model, and it has come out really, really nicely. Almost nothing in the way of, like, visible layer lines and stuff. Also, given that this is one, you know, printed in multiple parts, I'm pretty happy with how well it's all stuck together, too. I mean, the wings were printed separately, the body was separate, the weapon was separate, and so was the base. But yeah, I'm really happy with how this has come out. I think the Saturn IV Ultra has done a really good job with this, and it was pretty quick to print it as well. Now, one of the reasons that I printed these Cauldron Knights is not just because I've been wanting to print them for ages and this felt like a good excuse, but also because there's quite a lot of like kind of sweeping surfaces. So you've got some relatively flat surfaces like on the sword, which tend to be a really good place to pick up on really obvious layer lines I've found. But also on the armor itself, you've got some very soft curves and stuff, which again, it is really good. It looks really good. These sort of on the surface don't look like complex models, but there's quite a lot going on in terms of like different textures, and you've got little details like the rivets and stuff on the armor itself. Then you've got these like belt buckles, chainmail and cloth too. There's more to them than I think it first looks. And yeah, they've pretty much all come out really, really well. Little things like this one having that kind of scratch dent in the stomach, and on that shoulder there's a few sort of scratches as well. Part of the model, not like printing areas, come out really, really well, really nicely. Overall, I'm really impressed. Like, I'm really impressed. I will say, I don't necessarily know whether this is of a much higher standard than the Saturn 312K that I've got, but on the face of it at least, these were printed quite a bit faster than anything that's come out of that printer for me, and the quality is super high. In fact, we can do a little bit of a comparison, in fact. So I have here something that was printed on the Saturn 3, and if we take a look at it, there's a fair bit of texture going on here. I think perhaps the detail is just a little bit crisper on the Saturn IV models. Like, this isn't bad, and obviously it is a different model, so it's hard to compare one to one. But overall, comparing how complex this is and how complex this is, they're not altogether too different. It helps that these are both from Bestiarum Games, I believe. I think the Saturn IV Ultra just kind of edges it out. I think it's just a little bit crisper, a little bit finer overall. I think it's fair to say that the Saturn IV Ultra does produce some good prints. I think overall it is a decent printer. I mean, when we look at the pros and cons, well, let's do the pros first, shall we? So it's easy to set up, it has auto leveling. When it comes to getting into 3D printing, half the stuff that you need to do to enable your printer to work properly, the Saturn IV Ultra does it for you. It also produces really nice miniatures, and it does so in less time than, say, the Saturn III does. Overall, it is good, and it also has things like fail-safes to prevent you from sloshing resin out of the tank and into the innards of the printer, which is super helpful. But some of that is related to the AI camera, which we will get to in a minute. The AI camera sits firmly on the line between a pro and a con for me. It's something whereby it's a good idea, but the actual execution / implementation of it isn't ideal. Something else that is quite a con for me is the fact that it doesn't have a heated tank. So typically, I don't print in this room, in this studio. I print in the garage. Now, my garage is not insulated, and it is not heated, which can be something of a problem when you are resin printing. Because, for me personally at least, I find that the biggest kind of dictator of what is a successful or unsuccessful print is whether the resin stays at temperature throughout the print itself. And frankly, what I do to keep the resin at temperature simply does not work with the Saturn IV Ultra. For my Saturn III, I use this. Now, this is just a brewing strip. This is a heating element that wraps around the tank. It has a little control here that dictates how hot it gets and what temperature it maintains at. And if I want to print during the dead of winter when it's literally like 0 degrees in the garage, then I just put this around the tank on the Saturn III and it works perfectly. Every time I use this on that printer, I get a perfect print no matter what the actual temperature of the room is. And that makes a huge difference. The Saturn IV Ultra doesn't work like that, however, because the Saturn IV Ultra has got a tank that tilts. It moves down into the body of the printer, and that brewing strip is simply too thick to go around that tank. I can't use that method, which means that when I shift the Saturn IV Ultra out of this studio that's got a radiator in it that, controls the temperature of the room, suddenly it's going to be a lot more difficult to get consistent results purely because it will be in a space that is simply not properly good for 3D printing. Now, at some point, that garage is going to have a proper enclosure built in it for 3D printing, and the whole issue of ventilation and temperature will be sorted, but right now, I don't have that, so that's a significant downside for the Saturn IV Ultra. It produces things that are just as good, if not better, as my Saturn III, quicker, but only if it's in here right now, which isn't ideal, personally speaking. I will say that Elegoo do have a heater that they've announced, which I will be getting to try out, but I'm not convinced. Just looking at it, I'm not convinced. The design of it looks like it's either going to be blasting air down, which means it'll be blasting it onto just the case of the printer itself, which won't really do anything to heat the tank, or it's going to be blasting hot air upwards, which will just get caught in the top of the enclosure for the printer because hot air rises. Additionally, I'm not entirely sure how airflow is supposed to work, given that it doesn't seem to have any elevation between the surface it's sitting on and the intake / output for the fan itself. So I don't know how airflow is supposed to work. I'm going to get one and I'm going to try it, and I really hope that it does the job, but personally, I'm not 100% convinced. There are other solutions. I know there's a company called, I think it's Vatband, that do something similar to what I use, the brewer strip, but it's a lot thinner, which could work for the Saturn IV Ultra, which, again, if the Elegoo version does not work out, if their little heater, which is also an air purifier, but the little air purifiers are borderline worthless. I don't think there's any point using them. They don't seem to filter out anything. They don't seem to have any sort of impact on harmful particles, in my experience anyway. And they don't even get rid of the smell of resin half the time. So how good that element of it is, probably not great. So it is really close to being kind of perfect, this thing, but for me, a heated tank would just tip it right over the edge to being easily the best printer I've got by far in any situation, whereas currently it is kind of the best one I've got, but only in the situation of it being in this room with the heating on, which is not how I typically want to print. I don't want to sit here for, 2, 3, 4 hours with a respirator on, trying to edit stuff whilst a printer's running. That's just not fun. I don't want anything to do with it. Now, the other con, which is sort of a pro, but it's like, it's a good idea, but not well implemented, not well executed. The AI camera. So, first issue. The camera doesn't come with any sort of light. There's no light inside the case of the Saturn IV Ultra. Like, when the lid is down, it's a black tinted lid, so it's quite dark in there. The camera doesn't have a light attached to it, and it doesn't seem to have anything in the way of proper, like, IR or, like, night vision or anything like that, which means that if you've got it in a room with the lights off, say if you're printing overnight, for instance, and you tell it to do a lovely little time-lapse, it's not going to do a lovely little time-lapse. It's going to show you some vague shapes in varying scales of black and very dark grey, which is actually not really ideal for that particular purpose. It also makes me wonder how effective the AI side of things is going to be when it's that dark. I mean, I haven't actually tested that yet. I am going to be doing that over the weekend, though, because I'm really curious. I just haven't had a chance yet. Also, it does produce time-lapse videos. Time-lapse videos of 3D printing, super popular, right? Really popular. They get loads of views. However, they get loads of views in a very specific medium, and that is TikTok and YouTube Shorts. Now, what do those two formats have in common? If you're thinking they are designed so that they take up the entirety of your phone screen in portrait mode, you are absolutely correct. Which kind of begs the question, why did Elegoo put the camera in a landscape format? The time-lapse feature is cool, but it's in entirely the wrong aspect ratio for, like, the way that those time-lapses are usually consumed, which is kind of baffling, if I'm honest. Additionally, the camera does play some part in terms of fail-safes for the printer, but it's also not perfect. So I had an issue whilst I was testing the Saturn IV Ultra, whereby I mixed some resin in with an older bit of resin that was still in the tank. It's about 12 hours old, and I decided I was just going to keep going. I heated some resin up, I put it in the tank, I mixed it up, I had gloves on, so it was fine. And that meant that a bit of residue got around the outside of the tank, right? So the actual fill line wasn't, like, met. The resin wasn't higher than the max line on the tank, but there was a little bit of residue that had left a bit of a mark above it. The printer wouldn't print. It just wouldn't go. I had the cover off the camera and I tried to set the printer going and it would not let me print. It kept telling me that I had too much resin in the tank because there was a little line above the max fill line. I then tried it again, exactly the same result. I decided to test something and I put the cap back on the camera, and funnily enough, the printer started printing first time. Now, when it comes to preventing you from printing because you've got too much resin in the tank, that is unquestionably a good thing, because you do not want people filling the tank and then spilling resin into the innards of the machine. That's really bad. You don't want that. So, in a sense, it's a good failsafe to have, and it's a good way of doing it when you have that failsafe. On the other hand, I was able to bypass that seemingly just by covering the camera up, which kind of suggests that it's such an easy workaround to ignore that part of the failsafe entirely that I'm not really sure what the solution to that is, but I feel like it shouldn't be that easy, while simultaneously being very glad that it was. Very hypocritical, to be honest. I didn't want it to not print because it thought it was unsafe, because I knew it was safe. But the fact that I could just go, I'm just going to put the cap on it and try it again, and if it works, and it did work, kind of suggests that if I had overfilled the tank, then I would have just been able to ignore that warning anyway. Again, I'm not really sure how I feel about it. I just feel that that suggests that something in there isn't quite right, you know? So the camera for me is definitely a good idea, possibly not the best implementation. You know, it just could have been better. Overall, though, I would say if you are looking into, like, getting into 3D printing, you want something that is easy to use, that is simple to set up. You're going to be printing in a controlled environment where you dictate the temperature, and you want something that is going to produce good prints fairly quickly. I mean, the Saturn IV Ultra is definitely the thing for you, right? If that's what you want out of a printer, and you have the ability to print in a space where you control the temperature, then 100% I would recommend it, because you don't need to faff around with it. You can just load it up, set it going, and it'll be good. If, like me, you are printing in slightly more unpredictable circumstances, I don't think it's quite at the point where I would, willingly ditch, say, the Saturn III for the Saturn IV Ultra. Because, as it stands right now, I know I can use my Saturn III far more consistently than I can the upgrade, so to speak. That being said, for how much you're paying for it, I think it's worth it. But you do need to keep in mind that if you are in a position where you need to have kind of an additional layer of help for keeping things consistent, right now it might not be the easiest thing to balance in that way. As I say, I'm going to try the heater that Elegoo are putting out. I'm going to see if that makes a difference, see whether it actually provides that consistency that I tend to find using things like brewing strips on other resin printers. And if it does, brilliant. If it doesn't, it's going to be a bit of a headache trying to sort that out. So yeah, overall, good. For me specifically, there are things that I could do with being changed on it for personal taste and for personal use. But overall, I do like it a lot. I'd be lying if I said I didn't. Thank you very much to Elegoo for sending over the Saturn IV Ultra for me to take a look at. There'll be a link to it in the description and in the pinned comment for you to check out if you want to. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you for the next one.